Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was a civil engineer before the lights went strange and the news feed stalled, before the sirens in Cincinnati bounced off the glass of Fountain Square and set the pigeons into a panic spiral over Carew Tower. If anyone asks how we built a city beneath a city, I tell them we didn't build it as much as we recognized what was already there and stitched it together. Cincinnati hides stories under its streets, cellars that used to be taverns, ice caves, bootlegger tunnels, and most important to us, the abandoned subway cut that planners started digging a century ago and then gave up on. The tunnels were mostly dry, the air was cooler than above, and the concrete still rang solid beneath a hammer. It wasn't perfect, it was enough. I'm Alex Rios, 37, former project manager at the Metropolitan Sewer District. I spent years in high-vis vests, staring into shafts and thinking in elevations. My brain still narrates in culverts and cross-sections, and the polite geometry of right-of-way diagrams. Maybe that's why I survived. Outbreaks don't negotiate, but physics does. You give load a path. You give water a gradient. You give air a place to go. The living and the no longer living obey the shape of a space. When the emergency alerts hit our phones and TV crawls in those first days used words like clusters, we were already setting aside rebar LED shop lights and any diesel we could siphon. I'd worked side jobs with a union crew that knew the old subway alignments under Central Parkway stations near Race Street and Liberty. We didn't know how long we'd be down there. We just knew that above ground the streets were becoming unpredictable. The first 2 nights we still heard traffic. After that, helicopters and then only wind. We formed a council because we needed one. Dr. Priya Shah had run a clinic in Over the Rhine and moved with the steady calm of someone used to bad days. Nora Bennett, retired Army colonel, had a voice that traveled and a habit of quietly checking door hinges. And there was me, the one who knew where the water would run if the pumps failed. That was the early core. It grew quickly. Welders from an auto body shop, a librarian, who turned out to be the best quartermaster I've ever met, a stained glass artist who understood humidity like a scientist. Children, grandparents, a campus security officer from UC who'd been first on too many scenes and now wanted a place that didn't have sirens. We named the place the Buried Sanctuary one evening, because the absence of a name felt like a hole in a load-bearing wall. I drew a site map on a whiteboard in the old Race Street station shell. Residential sector along the largest dry caverns, farming sector in the loop where groundwater seeped and we could manage humidity for mushrooms. Water recycling in the compartment that still had intact sump connections, energy dotted all along the cross passages, a string of salvaged solar panels on rooftops up top, wired down to rack batteries, a small geothermal loop where 100 FT of ground gave a stable temperature for heat pumps, and a roll-your-eyes-yet-it-works flywheel. The machinist cobbled together from a cement mixer drum. Nora set our defense doctrine the way you might lay out a walkway through a garden. Straight where it needed speed, curved where it needed time. Choke points with steel doors, fire break lines marked by red tape and arrows, a flame curtain that was really 2 rows of overhead copper tubing fed from a gravity tank of diesel bioblend. If activated, it created a quick wall of heat across a portal. Our goal wasn't mayhem, it was separation. Time enough to close the next set of doors without anyone getting cornered. We learned discretion. Suppressors scavenged from a sporting goods store helped, but sound still travels weird underground. Nora trained teams in quiet tools, pry bars, hardwood battens, the kind of spears you make by affixing a sharpened spade to a conduit pipe. And yes, bows. It sounds theatrical, until you've seen someone put a carbon arrow into a target, with no more drama than an eye link. For firearms, we standardized on what we could feed, 9-ton 19mm carbines and pistols, because the magazines and parts interchange. 22 rimfire for small game hunts across the river in Kentucky, where the woods muffled sound. A couple of 12-gauge pumps for short-range emergencies, when you didn't need finesse so much as certainty. We catalogued every round, because you can't print ammunition with goodwill. Daily life found a rhythm that never entirely fit, and yet carried us. We ran the big fans at dawn and dusk to exchange the air through the vents we'd sealed with mesh and grease traps for scent control. Priya established a clinic near the water sector, where filters hummed and UV lamps glowed. The hydroponics team, led by Alina, a former brewery tech, converted food-grade totes and PVC tubes into nutrient film channels for lettuces, chard and dwarf tomatoes. For protein, we had beans, then mushrooms, then tilapia in 2 horse troughs connected to the hydroponic loop. In the evenings, we heard the soft tick of valves and the low ribbit of water like a heartbeat for the whole place. Above us, the city slept and didn't. Sometimes at night we climbed to our rooftops to sweep panels clean and take soundings. You can tell the difference between a stray dog and one of the infected by the way it moves. The dog veers. The infected move like a compass needle pulled by a point you can't see. We learned to become very small on those roofs to glide to avoid light. When we had to, we used radios in whisper mode and took routes with deep alleys and steel fire escapes we could retract. A trip up, a trip down. No heroics. The first serious scare didn't come from outside. It came as a headache. A few people started waking up with dry coughs and a rash that looked like nettle stings on their forearms. Priya asked questions in her kind, relentless way. Where do you sleep? What did you eat? Where do you work? We traced a cluster to the mycology chamber. Our oyster mushrooms were thriving so well that we had begun packing extra into drying nets. The smell in that room was rich and wet and good. And maybe, Priya said, heavy with spores, we weren't filtering well enough. We tested what we could with the last of our OTC kits. Nothing conclusive, but we changed the airflow, added damp curtains to scrub the air, and we started wearing masks in any space where we turned the earth. While we solved that, another problem approached on quiet feet. Curiosity from above. We thought the vents were secure. Stout grates, layers of mesh, a little stink of diesel to make them uninteresting. But heat carries a signal. And in October, when the nights got cold enough that our breath made clouds, creatures began to linger around the grates, listening. Scouts reported behavior we hadn't seen in the early months. Small clusters would pace a perimeter around an access cover, then go still together, as if some common thought had paused them. It might have been our imagination. We logged it as a trend anyway, because trends are the way a quiet detail turns into a plan. We divided our scouts into 2 branches. One group, the Pathfinders, moved along the rail cut and service corridors to map. The other, the Gatherers, traveled light, moving at last light to small targets we'd marked on a shared atlas. Targets weren't just groceries. We sought med cabinets, UPS battery racks, weatherproof junction boxes, bags of soil, clean fabrics, water chlorination chemicals. We avoided warehouses that had been obvious early targets. A dentist's office yielded floss and a hand-crank suction pump. An HVAC contractor's warehouse gave us spools of thermostat wire and bags of fasteners more valuable than any box of bracelets in a shop window. Our standard loadout was modest. 1 9mm carbine with 3 magazines, 1 sidearm as a backup if someone got separated, a compact first aid kit, a 2-way, a folding saw, and a rope bag. If a team brought more than they could carry at a quiet walk, Nora cut their manifests until they did. That's what it looked like when things worked. When things did not work, it looked like the night Jamal Carter took command of his own story. Jamal was 25 and a leader whether he meant to be or not. He'd played safety at Walnut Hills and then worked maintenance for the streetcar line. He moved well, thought fast, and believed, and I say this without judgment, that if we didn't take space above, we would be living in a salt mine for the next decade. He gathered 8 people who agreed. They proposed a test. Occupy an apartment building at the edge of over the Rhine, fortify it with braced doors and silent traps, and use it as a sunlit annex. The council said, no, annexes become islands. Nora said, is need bridges? Bridges get watched. Priya asked gentle questions about water, heat, and septic gas. I asked about egress, 1 stairwell, 2, how many ways out beyond windows into an alley that could become a funnel. Jamal listened, thanked us, and then went anyway. He took our best ladder and 2 of our quietest people. They were strong and careful, and for 3 days it looked like we had just lost an argument. Then a single radio call arrived in our channel, in a voice that sounded like breath scraping on a grater. They're testing the doors, not pounding, not ramming, testing. Latches, hinges, panels. Someone had made human behavior into a reflex. We launched a retrieval under cover of midnight cloud and rain, took a back way through a row house cellar, whose owner had probably sold whiskey through a sliding panel in the 1920s, and reached the annex. Jamal's team had barricaded with refrigerators, bolts, and screws. It wasn't enough. They were all alive when we came. We left the furniture where it lay, took the people and sealed the basement window behind us with 2 anchor bolts and a bead of expanding foam. The next day, scouts reported that a mass of the infected had gathered at the front entrance and then dispersed as if bored. "They'll come back," Nora said. From that day on, Jamal came to council. He didn't like us much more. He simply saw the shape of our decisions. The winter was kind to us, which is to say it wasn't as unkind as it could have been. We learned to sleep in layers. We rationed LED hours like we rationed sugar. On Sundays, the librarian, Marcia from College Hill, ran story circles. You could talk about a book, recite or remember a place you loved. We took turns describing sunlight. I drew it on the whiteboard as a series of arrows because I can't help myself. People laughed. It felt like the sound a room makes when heat comes on. In January, during a cold snap that turned the Ohio River to slate and stiffened the hydraulic lines on our freight elevator, we discovered the compromise that would mark the beginning of the end of our false peace. The way in wasn't dramatic. It was an 18-in ventilation conduit we had mapped and sealed during the first week. Bolted grate welded strap foam gasket. The strap was still there. The bolts were not. The grate was in place but different, slightly polished as if handled by small, patient fingers over and over again. We found it because we smelled air that wasn't ours. Air has stories too. Ours smelled of mild soap, iron, mushroom earth, and a particular resin from the cable ties we used everywhere. That day it smelled of wet leaves and a hint of something like copper. We called a full stop on movements while we checked every other vent. 10 were fine. At 2, the bolts had gone missing. No intrusion, just missing. We added lock plates. We rigged alarms of fishing line and jangling nuts. We established a quiet tower at dawn to listen. The next morning, the line jangled on shaft C12, and 3 minutes later we heard the first careful tap on a downstream door. It was gentle, patient, like a knuckle asking for entry. We held our breath until the fan cut on to give us pressure in the opposite direction. The tapping stopped. It would have been easy to call it nothing. Instead, we shifted to a new posture. Fewer gatherer runs, bigger pathfinder pushes to verify our back corridors, and a rethinking of our fail-safes. Nora wanted to wire demolition charges in the cross passages, small shots in pre-drilled holes to drop slabs and make instant dead ends. The mining crew we had by then, 3 siblings from a quarry outside Loveland, nodded like we were finally speaking sense. Priya didn't love the dust risk. I didn't love the loss of air pathways. But the plan made the kind of sense you write with a thick marker in block letters. You learn to tell time by sound, a freight train clattering across a distant bridge, water cycling through a system, the almost inaudible hiss when pressure equalizes across a door. I was in the water sector, on what should have been a normal Tuesday, checking the chlorination pump. When the hiss didn't sound right, it came with a whistle. That meant flow where there shouldn't be. I stepped into the hallway and felt it on my cheeks. A draft. That was when the radio clicked twice in the pattern. That meant drop everything and come. Footsteps in tunnels can be chorus or drumline depending on the floor. These were chorus. People converged on Sector D, one of the old station platforms we used for storage. Someone had moved the end cap on the maintenance duct behind it. Scratch marks along the edge were faint, like a cat looking for a weak point. If you're reading this to learn a trick, here it is. Treat scratches like math. Every line says direction, force, intent. These were parallel, low, repetitive, getting deeper toward one bolt we'd replaced with a shorter one, because we'd run out of long. That's the unwavering thing about disaster. It finds your 4 now and walks through it. We sealed D and cleared the area. The council met under a bare LED that made everything look like a diagram. We collapsed the spur, Nora said. We lose 3 storage bays. We lose our last cache of dry grain, Marcia said. We could move it, but we can't move the walls. Jamal looked from the bolt to the storage map and shook his head in the slow way of someone who has just seen a friend take a wrong turn in weather. What's downstream if they get past D? He asked me. I traced it with a finger. D connected to a fan alley that led to C12. C12 connected to a lateral that served the farming sector. We had doors, yes, but doors close when you get to them, not before. We argued and then started drilling. A good collapse is ugly only to the plan. To an engineer, it's like a poem with a sad ending. Predictable stress release written in 9/8 time. We drilled a spool line along the crown of the spur and loaded small charges. Emulsion sticks taped, capped, wired to a simple firing box powered by a battery. We babysat as carefully as any patient. We sandbagged a shield, evacuated and counted down. The wet sound of concrete cracking is something you don't forget. It felt like the earth shrugging. Dust rolled like fog. We waited, then cleared, then listened. The after was a series of rosy metrics. Dropped slab, crushed duct, nothing moving. We signed off and logged it a win. By the next morning, 2 more vents had their bolts missing. We locked the sanctuary down like a ship in bad seas. Quiet hour turned into quiet morning. We took groups outside at carefully staggered times for rooftop panel cleaning and water barrel checks. The little greenhouse we'd built on a north side rooftop as a maybe someday became a liability on a map that was no longer ours. We stripped it, salvaged the film and left the frame. If you'd watched us from a distance, you might have thought we were ants removing crumbs one by one from a table set with trouble. 2 weeks later, during a supply run to a hospital clinic in Clifton Heights, we learned what steady pressure looks like when patience meets numbers. The gatherer team, 3 plus a driver, found the pharmacy cabinet where a tech had once labeled everything with careful block letters. Analgesic, antiemetic, electrolyte solution, saline. They were moving back toward the stairwell when something pressed against the doors from the other side. Not slamming, just leaning. The movement had the group feeling of a crowd at a fair when the person in front sees something and everyone else sways without knowing why. The team waited. The pressure didn't change. The radio whisper said, "They aren't pushing, they're taking turns." That's when Nora altered our doctrine. Before we'd sought to avoid contact, now we aimed to manipulate it. She designed decoys, sound devices made from hand-crank radios taped to metal coffee cans, set to emit a periodic tick that could be heard at 15 YD 20 in a stairwell. We set them at corners to pull anything curious away from our actual routes. If you've never watched a group of the infected pivot toward a tick like sunflowers turning to the sun, I hope you never do. The devices worked for a while. Then the tick stopped drawing as many bodies. We changed the pattern, then changed it again. We kept changing until it felt like we were playing chess against wind. Inside, life was still life. Babies had birthdays, a couple married in the station, where a mosaic had lost half its tiles and still managed to look like a sunrise. We used LEDs to make a circle of light and stood in it with our tools in our back pockets like Lucky Charms. For an hour, nothing terrible happened. In March, a new illness crept through. Not fever, not cough, more like pressure, headaches, sinus pain, a sense that the air was thick and when the fans ran. Priya stepped carefully between what she could name and what she could not. Possibly elevated CO2 in sleeping compartments, possibly an allergen, possibly a mild fungal irritation from our mushroom chambers. She rotated sleeping quarters to break patterns, put extra plants into the residential corridors, and asked us to cut back mushroom harvesting for a week so we could deep clean. The mush team wasn't happy. Oyster and lion's mane had become our protein and comfort, but they wore masks and brought in shop vacs, and we washed every ward we could reach. The next week, symptoms eased. We added one more item to the list of things that required vigilance. In April, after a heavy rain, a Pathfinder team followed a storm drain lateral to check a brick culvert that dated to the 19th century. The mortar in older brickwork responds to time like a person does. It becomes softer and more dignified until it crumbles in a way that isn't. The team's leader, a patient man named Olden, who could tell you the era of a wall by the color of the clay, found something lodged in the culvert grate. A human hand would raise alarms. This was worse in a way that was quieter. A bent section of rebar, polished and then rough, where someone had used it against concrete. It looked like a tool and a message at once. "They're learning from us," said I believed him and then tried not to think about what learning meant for something that didn't meet you with language. There are days I wish we had picked a different city, someplace with no tunnels, but then I remember that there is no city with no subcellar, no basement, no service corridor a person could use if they had a reason. The map is not the danger. The map is the way back. It happened in early June on a morning when the air felt like a cool hand on a forehead. The alarms on both C12 and another vent 2 corridors away tinkled within a minute of each other. We dispatched a team to each. I took the C12 team with Nora, while Jamal took the other. We walked on the balls of our feet, the way you do when your body becomes an ear. At C12, the grate looked unbothered. the fasteners in place. Beside it, a smear of something like clay darkened the concrete near the floor. Nora looked at me, and I looked at the smear, and we both thought the same thing. It was shoe mud, not ours. Someone had been here and then left. We went quiet enough to hear the blood in our heads. Then the radio crackled with a single word from Jamal's team. Hinge. The door at the far vent had been hinged on our side. That's normal. What wasn't normal was that the hinge pin had been half pushed out from the other side. Someone or some set of someones had found a way to pry in a small crescent of movement and tap a pin loose with the patience of dripping water. I checked the door frame and found a shallow scratch around the bolt that served as a latch catch. The scratch was new. There was the faintest smell of breath. That afternoon, we changed our status from secure to situational, which was a phrase we invented to avoid saying the word that ends planning cultures, compromised. We decided to accelerate the demolition plan. We would cut and drop 2 non-essential spurs and 1 short cross passage that we'd used as a convenience corridor but could live without. The mining siblings, Sam, Ruth and Laya, laid out the charges with a tender concentration that reminded me of baking. A dozen of us set out to move supplies we'd staged nearby. We worked until our arms trembled. The idea was to act before night, when above-ground activity often increased like a tide. We didn't make it. The alarm at Dichimed then chimed again, then went silent. Not a fade, but a cut, like a wire had been lifted off a hook. We were between stacks of crates when a sound came up through the floor of the adjoining tunnel. Not a knock, not a shout, but the sort of low chorus you hear under a stadium 20 minutes before a game. A mass, a murmur, a feeling. I saw Nora register it and reach for the radio. Phase 1. She didn't shout. She never shouts. People just hear her. Doors thumped as they sealed. The flame curtain at the next portal hissed to life. Not to burn anything so much as to warn them off and give us light. We had rehearsed. Rehearsals never match turnout, but they keep your hands from making the wrong choice first. Jamal took a fire team to the right to hold the lateral while we armed the charges. I went with Sam and Ruth to the spur. Sam set the last cap and we started to back out when I heard it. The minute rattle of a chain I'd never noticed at the far end of the spur. A lock someone had left dangling in a way that only noise gives away. The rattle was small. The silence behind it was large. But I turned my light off and listened with my skin. They came without yelling, of course. They came like fog, like they had become the space. The first one's silhouette appeared at the far end. Her shoulder before a head because the ceiling dipped there. And even in whatever state you want to call it, a human shape still ducks under a low beam. Behind it, more shoulders. The rhythm-like steps, time to breathe. No one remembered learning. I clicked my light on low and found the target for the detonator. A clay loop of wires on the wall. Clear, I said. Clear, echoed Ruth, already moving. We pulled back. I tried not to see their faces because that isn't useful, and because we had people we love to aim our focus toward. We reached the bend, put up the shield, and I gave us an extra half-second, because everything in me wanted to be sure no one's foot was still in the bad place. Then we dropped the roof. The shock wave moved through us like a door opening. Dust carried tastes, mineral, old rust. The dry paper of collapsing forms. The chorus sound cut off. We waited, counted, listened for secondary falls. None. Nora ordered phase 2. We fell back to the next line where the flame curtain had died to a line of warm pipes. Jamal's team checked intact, but they'd used their last smoke to confuse a group that had smelled its way toward the lateral. We lost the spur. We lost the storage in it, and we did not stop them. That's the thing you tell the story around if you want it to be true. The drop blocked one path, but a group of the infected had already split at an earlier junction and found another vent we had written off as too small for a problem. The thing about problems is they don't care what you write. Inside the farming sector, a small crew had been trimming basil under LED strips when they heard a sound that didn't belong to plants or pumps. A soft drag of something against a growing table. They managed to fall back into the corridor and pull the secondary door, but the door wasn't designed to be a main line. It held with a metallic whine the way your knee holds when you run up the last hill. You promised yourself you wouldn't. That bought us 15 minutes. 15 minutes is years in a place where timers count in breaths. Nora shook a smoke can, triggered it and rolled it like a bowler into the lateral to slow anyone coming up behind. Priya organized a rotation of people with masks to help anyone in the farming sector who could still run. Alina killed the lights in the hydroponics loop to make our space look less interesting. The mining crew split. Ruth to check the small cross-passage drop. Sam to help me wire a last-ditch cut across the main connector that would keep the infected from reaching residential if they got past the farm. Laya did something I will always be grateful for and would never have thought to do. She grabbed a grease pencil and wrote directions at each corner. Simple arrows to out to air to water. Panic turns smart people into lost people. Arrows make a map out of fear. Jamal caught up with me outside the connector and handed me a roll of extra wire without my asking. His face looked like a man who had put down a heavy thing too late. "We're with you," he said, which wasn't the same thing as "I was wrong," which would have been an unhelpful sentence in any case. I skinned wire, twisted, taped, and taped again, because tape has stopped more disasters than any speech. Nora came up on the net. Farm door integrity at 60% and falling. Move. We pulled the last person out of the farm, a teenager named Eli with a tray of seedlings he refused to drop, and which I later realized kept his hands from shaking. And then we closed the connector door and set the charge. The door wasn't designed to take demolition flash on its own side, so we built a little shield of sheet steel and bags of gravel to protect it from our own decision. I gave Nora a nod. She gave me one. We pulled back through two corners to avoid the overpressure. The cut took. The tunnel beyond it shifted like a jaw, finally unclenching, and then settled into a new, uglier geometry that promised one beautiful thing. Not passable. Dust filled the corridor. Alina started to cough and then cover her face with a sleeve, and then laugh in a way that sounded more like a sob. "We lost the tomatoes," she said. "I can regrow them," Priya said, which I believed because she said it like she would will it into truth if the world didn't cooperate. In a story that wants to be clean, the breach would end there with our brave cut sealing our home and us all clasping hands under the humming LEDs. I love clean stories. I also know concrete. Dust finds the places you pretended were tight. It leaked into residential over a threshold where the floor dipped a quarter-inch toward a drain. We masked up and ran the fans against damp filters we'd made for other kinds of risk. The air tasted like powder, and then like nothing. We did a head count, and in that terrible math we discovered two less than the number we should have had. One was a builder named Angus, who had gone with Nora to the far lateral and might still be working. The other was a child, Lily 8, who had a habit of hiding in the mushroom chamber to watch the way light glowed through the white caps. The chamber had been one of the first we sealed when the first alarm sounded. It was also connected to a small service passage we'd never loved and had promised ourselves we would widen someday. Someone said Lily's name. The sound ran through us like current. We didn't have time to plan. We had practice instead. I took two with me, and Jamal took two, and we moved like we'd rehearsed. The lead with a baton, the second with a light and a hook, the third with a job of saying stop at the right time. The mushroom chamber door had an observation port we'd installed for the fun of watching growth. I wiped dust from the port with my sleeve and peered in. The LEDs were off, but the dim light from the corridor showed shapes like sculptures in snow. One of them moved small and quick, and then a voice whispered in a tone you would use if you were trying not to wake a sleeping animal. "Alex, relief can make your knees a bad idea." I leaned my forehead against the cool of the steel, and then remembered where we were and unleaned. We cracked the door just enough to slide in sideways. The room smelled earthy and clean and safe in a way that made something ache. Lily stood under a shelf with her hands on two support posts, like a person bracing in a subway when the train starts. She had a filter mask on upside down, better than nothing. I signaled, and she stepped to me with the solemnity of a person who knows rules matter. We moved out behind us. Something thumped once against the service door. A small sound, a tension, nothing more. We closed our door, spun the wheel, and then did something I am not proud of, but which worked. We wedged that door with a broken crowbar and ran a bead of foam into the gap. It would hold 5 minutes. We took 30 seconds to hug the child, then walked. We did not run. Running gets you numbers wrong. When we made it back to the main corridor, I let myself look up and down it like a person leaving a storm cellar after the wind has moved on. People stood in small groups, silent in that way that means an orchestra is waiting for the baton to tap the music stand. Nora appeared, her hair dusted like she'd aged a decade in an hour. Angus came in from the lateral with a limp and a grin, and a rope sling around his shoulders, that suggested he'd used his own weight to close a door no one meant to open. He patted Lily's head like it was the promised land. We were holes and patching and improbable math, and we were still us. We slept in shifts for 3 days and then not at all for 1. Then we slept like people who had been holding breath for 2 weeks. When we woke, the new map sat on the whiteboard in lines that felt like a confession. Sectors gone, routes gone, but a home still coloured in green. We had lost the basil, the tomatoes, 2 racks of greens, a storage bay of grain, and 3 corridors that made life easier. We had lost the myth that we were invisible to the world above. We had not lost anyone, and that mattered more than all the shapes. After the breach, the council split into 2 camps. And I don't mean emotionally, I mean physically. Half of us stayed with the sanctuary, hardening, fixing, rerouting air, and rebuilding the hydroponics in the space we still had. The other half, led by Nora and surprisingly by Jamal, started planning an above-ground option that wouldn't be an annex but a fallback. A fortified district built not as a dare to the streets, but as a series of layered zones with redundant exits, powered by the battery banks we could move and the panels we could defend. "The tunnel saved us," Nora said, "and it will again, but a fox knows more than one path to the den." We picked a candidate area, a triangle of blocks near Finley Market, with brick buildings whose roof lines connected. Narrow streets we could barricade with dumpsters and crushed cars, and sight lines that let us see movement before movement saw us. Water was the question. It always is. We mapped a route to a main that still had static pressure. The gravity feed from a tank on higher ground, and we scred gate valves we could operate by hand. It would never be perfect. It would be something. We practiced moving a convoy through quiet streets with lookouts on high rhythm that felt like an old movie, and then felt nothing like that when a light wind moved paper across an intersection and everyone ducked because sound does what sound does. We tested a silent hoist we rigged with sailboat blocks and a theatre, winch to lift crates to roofs. We set decoy radios 2 blocks away and watched the pattern of curiosity adjust like a tide calendar you hadn't noticed. Being nailed to the wall next to your life, we brought back a measure of sun. Down below the sanctuary changed shape again. The mushroom chambers took over the space where the basil once grew, and the new hydroponics channels ran tighter, more vertical with staggered towers instead of horizontal runs to save floor space. Alina designed a rotating rack you could turn by hand for equal light distribution. We joked and called it the salad wheel. It squeaked in a way that made me want to find it a drop of oil even in my sleep. We improved air. We added CO2 monitors built from scavenged sensors and a microcontroller a former UC student coaxed back to life with a soldering iron he treated like a magic wand. We set the fans to modulate based on levels instead of time alone. Priya measured headaches in a notebook and drew a curve that bent down with each improvement. The curve didn't hit 0. Curves in real life rarely do, but it kissed the axis in a way that felt like a promise. And then the choice found us. It didn't knock. It arrived as a fact written in bolt heads. One morning in late July, Marshall went to rotate the stacks of tinned food we kept in the deep pantry and found that a shelf at the back had been shifted an inch. On the floor there was a crescent of dust you wouldn't notice unless you notice things. She does. Behind the shelf, the wall bore a circle, faint and oddly regular, as if someone had traced a manhole cover where no manhole cover should be. I had never seen that circle because the shelf had always been there. That isn't exactly true. I had seen it and filed it under artifact. An old fill patch from when the subway cut was connected to service corridors that had later been abandoned. It wasn't that anymore. It was a disclosure. The mortar was hairline cracked. Someone had pushed that circle from the other side at least once. We had built a city out of seams, and we had ignored one seam because it hid behind food. We had been lucky. We were not going to be lucky again if we didn't act. The council met with a map and a willingness to say uncomfortable words. "We can keep stitching," Priya said. "Or we can cut, but cutting will not feed anyone." "We cut," Nora said. "We cut and we go up. Not forever, not in triumph. In rotation, half up, half down. With transfer points and shared watch, we become 2 places and keep both alive." Jamal surprised me by nodding first. "We won't call it annex," he said. "We'll call it wing. Wings are how you move without falling." We spent 8 days preparing a move most of us never wanted. We trained people who'd never been on rooftops to move on rooftops. We wrapped battery racks in rubber and built skids. We labeled everything with arrows and big words like water and air, because emergencies turn every label into a path home. We chose a morning when a front would push wind from the west, so that our scent and sound might carry toward blocks we didn't need to cross. We dressed in the dull colors of brick and shadow. We told a story out loud, so that it would be ready in our throats when we needed to say it without shaking. We go quiet. We go light. We go together. We keep a way back. We set the last charges where they needed to be, if the circle in the pantry became a door with the wrong hands on our side. The electrician Thomas, who had once wired stages for rock shows, set a timer on the lights in specific corridors so that if triggered, one zone would go dark and another would go bright in a sequence designed to make a curious mind follow the wrong trail. It felt like magic, which is what engineering looks like when your heart is pounding. At dawn on the 9th day, we lifted the first crate into light. The city was the city quiet, then not, then quiet again, like the chest of a sleeping animal that might be dreaming. We moved along the roofline above Finley, past the red brick ribs of buildings that had seen floods, riots, parades, and now us with our carts and hopes. The morning light fell like water over old stone. If a person had been painting it, they would have added a brighter streak where a leaf moved in a breeze that didn't touch the ground yet. Our lookout signaled clear. We shifted weight like a chorus line with no audience but one. The first battery rack reached its new cradle, and the microgrid Jesus wired by Thomas chirped alive like a bird, thinking about a song. Below in the sanctuary, a sensor tripped on a small fluctuation. A mesh resting on a vent flexed a millimeter, and then stilled. A door we had downgraded from red to orange months ago creaked faintly as its frame warmed with the day, or with breath, or with meaning. The timer lights ran their script once at half speed. No footsteps followed. We made the second lift. If you're waiting for a chase, for a sprint across sunlit roofs with silhouettes reaching, I'm glad to tell you we didn't get one. The morning was ours. We placed panels like lily pads and linked them like hands. We hoisted water containers and rolled them into place with the care you give anything heavier than a decision. We raised 3 lines of sight-posts and hung a strip of reflective tape at each, so that in moonlight, if all else failed, an arrow would still point toward a door you could close behind you. By noon, the Finley wing existed on paper, in wire, in bolts through roof joists and batteries humming under shade. By dusk, we had people sleeping in 3 apartments whose windows we had bricked in from the inside to make walls within walls. By midnight, the microgrid sank into a steady rhythm that meant the day had worked. I walked a patrol across the roof and looked toward the river where a barge had once stood moorowed and now had become a raft for weeds. The city smelled like summer, brick, dust, something sweet from somewhere no one had tended for a while. I sat with my back against a chimney and listened. In the morning, 2 small groups moved between wing and sanctuary, trading goods and stories on a schedule that looked like a cardiogram. We kept the radio quiet. We spoke in hand signals and notes passed down a line. Priya set up a satellite clinic above, sunlight making her instruments look hopeful. Nora split watches and set whistles that spoke 3 notes. Come caution, cover. Jamal installed a ladder that folded into a wall and vanished. He looked like a person who had found a job that matched the inside of his head. Down below, the pantry wall held for a day, then 2, then another. On the 4th day, hairline cracks spread in a spiderweb. We heard the faintest scratching, a whisper of plaster grit sliding along concrete. We prepared the last lever that would drop a section of wall into the void beyond and seal a story with a chapter we didn't wish to write. I put my palm flat against the cool circle and thought of all the people who had leaned on walls like this in cities after floods and during power outages and while waiting for days to become days again. Then I set aside my thoughts and picked up my role. On your signal, Nora, I said. On yours, she said back, because trust moves both ways or it doesn't move at all. We dropped the wall. It landed with a concussion that rolled down the corridor and back like thunder bouncing between hills. Dust bloomed pale and slow. The scratching stopped. There were no hands reaching through cracks. No voices, no faces, only silence shaped by our choice. The pantry was smaller now. The sanctuary was smaller now. We were not. I write this in a notebook I stole fair square from a storeroom, stacked with office supplies for meetings that never happened. My hands are steady. The lights above my table are powered by a panel that used to show up in real estate brochures as green. The water in my bottle tastes faintly of plastic and victory. Lily just ran past me, then came back and scolded me for writing crooked lines on a page with squares. Alina is arguing with Thomas about whether the salad wheel should turn clockwise or counterclockwise for even growth. Prius is teaching a class on how to tell a headache from a warning. Nora is sharpening a pencil with a knife she keeps so clean it might be a mirror. Jamal is on the roof checking the tie-downs before a storm that may or may not arrive. We live in two places that are one place. The wing feeds the sanctuary with light and air, and the sanctuary feeds the wing with water and calm. We move in shifts like tides. We go up when the wind and the watch agree. We go down when the roofline turns to shadow and voices carry in strange ways. We listen to vents like they are instruments. We treat doors like friends. Sometimes at night we still hear the city breathe. The chorus sound rises in the distance and then falls as if the streets remember how crowds feel. I don't know what the next map would look like. I know how to draw it when it arrives. A line thick where the weight goes, an arrow where the air wants out, a note to self where something looks fine and isn't. I know what belongs on every page of every plan. Names, dates, the small decisions that make it possible to open a door and meet morning with something like grace. You ask how we survive. We survive by making good seams and honest cuts, by telling the truth about what walls can do and what they can't, by building two homes, one in light and one in cool stone, and never letting either believe it is alone. And when the day comes, and it will, that wing must pull us up like a rope, and the sanctuary must let us go like a hand releasing another. We'll make that cup with the same care. We'll carry what we can. We'll mark the rest. We'll leave the whiteboard map and a note at the door for whoever finds it after us. Air is good here. Water is clean. Go quietly. Take the stairs on the left. The right stairs end in a wall. If they read it, they'll know someone thought of them. If they don't, the wall will teach. The city has always held two stories at once. The one above, crowded and loud, and the one below, quiet and patient. We are both. The buried sanctuary is not a bunker. It's a promise written in concrete and light. We will make a way. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.